Imagine this. You're 19 years old. You've never left your hometown. You've never held a rifle. And then one morning, a letter arrives at your door. It says, "Report for duty." Thousands of miles away, in a jungle so thick the sun never touches the ground, something is waiting for you. Something your government refuses to fully explain. Something your generals are lying about. And something that will change America forever. This is Vietnam. The Vietnam War began in good faith, by good people with good intentions. But some 2 decades later, it was all over. For the Vietnamese, this was never a war about communism. It was a war for independence, a war for Vietnam itself. But a deadly combination of American overconfidence, Cold War paranoia, and the very imperialist tendencies Americans had once fought so hard against turned Vietnam into one of America's darkest chapters in its short but incredibly dense history. By the time the last helicopter left Saigon, more than 58,000 Americans were dead, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas, and over 2 million civilians, men, women, and children from both the North and the South, plus thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. Let that sink in. Millions of lives. For a war that, as you'll soon find out, those at the very top knew could not be won. But to understand how it all happened, we need to go back. Way back. The French conquest of Indochina began in 1858. They boasted about bringing their civilization to Vietnam. Roads, bridges, progress. But the Vietnamese didn't want French civilization. They wanted their own civilization, their own country. Just as they'd resisted the Chinese centuries before, they resisted the French. Then came 1919. The Great War had just ended. American President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris to help rebuild the world, championing the independence of colonized nations. It sounded beautiful, and then a young man appeared outside the president's office. He carried a petition signed by himself and other Vietnamese nationalists, asking simply, "Let Vietnam be free." The president's secretary promised to deliver it. There is no evidence Wilson ever read it. That young man had gone by nearly 70 different names throughout his life, but he would eventually settle on the one history would never forget: Ho Chi Minh. Think about that. The entire war, the millions of deaths, the burning villages, the broken families, might have been avoided if one man had simply read one letter. Ho Chi Minh was marked for arrest after protesting a puppet emperor and fled Vietnam in 1911, spending 30 years in exile. It was during this time he discovered the anti-colonial writings of Lenin and became a communist. Not because he loved communism, but because communism was the only force willing to help him achieve what he truly wanted: an independent Vietnam. By 1940, the world was on fire. Germany had swallowed most of Western Europe. France had fallen, and Japan moved into Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh saw his moment. He returned home and founded a revolutionary fighting force, the Vietnam Independence League. The Viet Minh. Here's where it gets fascinating and almost unbelievable. In the spring of 1945, the United States government was looking for ways to undermine Japanese forces in Vietnam. They reached out to Ho Chi Minh. The OSS, the precursor to the CIA, actually supplied Ho and his guerrillas with weapons. They were impressed by how quickly his fighters learned to use them. Ho began calling his followers the Viet American Army. He praised the United States as a champion of democracy. America and Ho Chi Minh were allies. When the atomic bombs fell on Japan and surrender was imminent, Ho acted fast. He called upon all Vietnamese people to rise up and take control before the French could return. On September 2nd, 1945, the same day Japan surrendered, ending World War II, hundreds of thousands flooded Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, and Ho Chi Minh stood before them and declared Vietnam independent. The crowd roared. The future looked bright. And then, everything fell apart. President Roosevelt, who had championed independent self-governing nations, was dead. His successor, Harry Truman, was staring down a completely different world. The Soviet Union was spreading. Eastern Europe was falling. Cold War fear gripped Washington. France played its hand perfectly. They warned, if you support Vietnamese independence, we may fall to Soviet influence. So America, the country that had once helped Ho Chi Minh fight the Japanese, now funded the French to go back into Vietnam and crush the independence movement. The betrayal was complete. By 1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea, and domino theory became gospel. The idea was simple. If one country falls to communism, the next one goes. Then the next. Then the next. Like dominoes. The French, backed by American dollars, fought the Viet Minh for 7 years. Trains blown up, platoons ambushed, roads blocked. The jungle became a graveyard. Then came Dien Bien Phu. The French set up a fortified base in a valley, completely confident in their position. So confident, they didn't even bother worrying about the jungle-covered hills surrounding them. Big mistake. 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers quietly surrounded the valley. Heavy artillery rolled into the hills. And then they opened fire. The French were trapped. After 55 days of brutal combat, they surrendered, 8,000 troops lost. After 100 years of colonial rule, France was done. And the Viet Minh learned something dangerous that day. They could fight a great Western power and win. Vietnam was split at the 17th parallel. The Communist North, the U.S.-backed South, and almost immediately, it started falling apart. The South was supposed to be a democracy. Instead, under President Diem, it became a dictatorship. Corruption ran deep. Buddhists were persecuted by Catholic government officials. The oppression became so unbearable that a 73-year-old monk set himself on fire in silent protest. A Buddhist monk becomes a martyr, someone repeated. Again and again. Others followed. When John F. Kennedy took office, Cold War tensions were at a fever pitch. His advisors screamed, "Send troops." He refused. Instead, he sent the Green Berets, military advisors, helicopters, funding, and authorized the use of napalm and Agent Orange to destroy Viet Cong cover and crops. But Diem's regime had to go. South Vietnamese generals quietly told the U.S. wouldn't stop them, assassinated Diem and his brother. People celebrated in the streets. 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson was now president, and he had inherited a nightmare. Between January 1964 and June 1965, South Vietnam cycled through 8 different governments. Chaos. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin. The USS Maddox was moving through the Gulf when it came under fire from a North Vietnamese torpedo squadron. Ho Chi Minh was furious and removed the officer responsible for impulsiveness. But back in Washington, the military wanted retaliation. Johnson said no, a second attack would be needed. A second attack, that never happened. Sonar operators convinced themselves an attack had probably occurred, and probably was apparently good enough. Based on a ghost attack, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, handing Johnson the legal authority to deploy U.S. forces across Southeast Asia. America went to war based on an attack that almost certainly never happened. By March 1965, ground troops were in Vietnam, and the hell began. Soldiers hacked through elephant grass, thorn bushes, and bamboo 20 meters tall. Jungle so thick it took an hour to move 100 feet. Leeches caused wounds. That quickly became infected. Booby traps and landmines waited on every path. M16 rifles jammed in firefights, costing soldiers their lives. And the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. By 1966, 200,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The Viet Cong controlled 3/4 of the South Vietnamese countryside. 3 million tons of explosives fell on the Ho Chi Minh Trail alone. More than everything dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. The American people were told, don't worry, we're killing them at a ratio of 10 to 1. But American mothers didn't care about the 10. They cared about the 1. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told Johnson directly, the chances of winning are no better than 1 in 3. The war is unwinnable. Johnson sent more men anyway. At the start of 1968, 500,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam. Victory, the public was told, was right around the corner. Then came January 31st, 1968. The Vietnamese Lunar New Year Tet. While thousands of troops had gone home for the holiday, 84,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers launched simultaneous attacks on 36 provincial capitals, dozens of military bases, and the 6 largest cities in South Vietnam, including Saigon itself. The Viet Cong were in the streets, in buildings, out in the open, and America crushed them. Of the 84,000 fighters, 58,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a military victory for the United States. But it didn't matter, because the American people had been told the war was nearly over. And then they turned on their televisions and watched their cities burning. The trust was gone. It never fully came back. Protests exploded. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then Robert Kennedy, shot dead while campaigning to end the war. The nation hadn't been this divided since the Civil War. Richard Nixon won the presidency on a promise to end the war. But the way he got there was one of history's darkest secrets. As Johnson made real progress toward peace, stopping bombing, getting Hanoi to finally agree to talks, a Nixon campaign representative secretly contacted the South Vietnamese government. The message: stay out of the peace talks. Nixon will give you a better deal. Johnson found out. He had proof Nixon's team was committing treason, contacting a foreign power during wartime to sabotage peace negotiations. Nixon had been willing to let the war continue, let more soldiers die, just to win an election. Johnson, unable to reveal how he obtained the intelligence, said nothing. Nixon's secret was safe, and the war went on. Vietnamization became Nixon's policy, gradually shifting the war back to South Vietnamese forces while bringing Americans home. But as both American and South Vietnamese officials privately admitted, if 500,000 U.S. troops couldn't win, the South Vietnamese alone had no chance. The My Lai massacre, 500 innocent men, women, and children slaughtered by American soldiers in a small village, was exposed. Protests surged. 4 students were killed at Kent State, 2 more at Jackson State. Nixon launched the Christmas bombing of 1972. 1,600 civilians killed in Hanoi. 12 days later, Hanoi returned to negotiations. A deal was reached. America had bombed them into an agreement. March 29, 1973. The last American troops left Vietnam. Nixon had promised South Vietnam, if you're ever in danger, we'll come back. But in August 1974, Nixon resigned over Watergate. Congress cut South Vietnam's funding in half. Up to 20,000 ARVN troops deserted every month. America had provided guns, but not enough bullets. Planes, but no trained pilots. Trucks, but no spare parts. The North pushed south. Saigon began to fall. April 29, 1975. The evacuation began. Helicopters ferried desperate people to aircraft carriers offshore, then raced back for more. When the ships filled up, helicopters were pushed into the ocean to make room. The South surrendered. After 30 years of war, 2 million deaths, millions displaced, villages burned to ash, Vietnam was finally unified under one communist nation. The war left scars that never healed. 1.5 million Vietnamese eventually fled. 400,000 made it to America, the very country that had bombed their homeland. As John Kerry once said, the Vietnam War brought everything into question. The destruction of villages to save them. The falsified body counts. The meaningless battles where men died for hills they immediately gave back. The pride that turned every unimportant skirmish into an extravaganza. Because America couldn't lose, couldn't retreat, no matter how many lives it cost to prove that point. It was never a soldier's war. It was a political war, fought by young men who deserved better, on both sides. And for everyone who fought, who sacrificed, who showed bravery in jungles and rice fields and burning cities, they should never be forgotten. Because America and Vietnam, they will never be the same.